welcome to Makeup and Monarchies. If you are new here, my name is Tiffany. I am a cosmetologist, hairstylist, makeup artist, and lover of all things UK history. Today we're going to be talking about Edward III of England. Got the itch to do one about him because I was discussing the 100 Years' War with somebody, and there's so much to unpack in this whole time period. So I figured we'd start with Edward III. If you have not done so yet, please hit the subscribe button. If this is something that you would like to, or that you enjoy, or want to help me out, go ahead and share this with your friends. I, as usual, will put all the details of what I'm using for makeup in the description box down below. I think that's about it. I'm not going to delay anymore. You're going to see me in a second. My face is an absolute garbage pit today. Yeah, that's that. So let's just get into it. Hello. If you are new here and you did not watch my videos from over the winter, you may not know this, but I have eczema. And for like the entirety of my life, it's been mainly on my hands. But now I'm getting older and it's on my fucking eyes. So please excuse my face. So we're going to talk about Edward III today. And I kind of got this little like buzz to do a video about him because I was doing lives and we were talking about the 100 Years' War, and I was like, Edward III is so interesting because so much shit spawned from that time period. So I thought, let's just talk about Edward. So that's what we're going to do. So Edward was born on November 13th at Windsor Castle. He was the firstborn son of Edward II and Isabella of France. Before we get into baby Edward's life, we're going to back up a little bit, because we got to talk about daddy for a second. And the way the world was when Edward was born. Edward III, baby Edward, Prince Edward. So Edward was born during a very problematic time in England due to his father's reign and due to some poor choices by Edward II. He alienated English nobles and Scottish allies by abandoning the war in Scotland that his father, Edward I, had started. On top of this, his choice of favorites at court were not well liked, and it pushed nobles further away. However, when baby Edward was born, Edward II's relations improved with the French, and the nobility was settled for some time. Baby Edward was titled, I just put tan on my hand. It's not Timu tan, I promise. If you are familiar with that. I just quickly did it. I apologize. So he was titled Earl of Chester at 12 days old. And by January of the following year, 1313, he was given an entire household. At a young age, he was taught by a tutor, Richard de Bury, who was the Bishop of Durham. He was known for centuries as a major bibliophile, which is a lover of books. I call myself an Anglophile. Actually, my husband calls me that. The bishop became a mentor to Edward, and he learned to read and write in French and Latin. Now we have to go back again and talk about Daddy Edward. Like I said a few minutes ago, he'd lost his support from the nobility because of who he had as favorites. And those were... So let's talk about that for a second. These two men were Piers Gaveston and Hugh Despenser, the younger. Piers was killed during a noble rebellion against Edward in 1312, Daddy Edward, and Hugh was hated by the nobility. Edward had led unsuccessful campaigns, and in 1322, little Edward's about 10 at this time, he didn't help his case and when he had his cousin, Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, executed. Because the English crown had lands in France, actually the English held more territories in France than France themselves. Edward II was faced with a demand from his brother-in-law, Charles IV, to pay homage for the English Duchy of Aquitaine in 1325. Because of the discontent that was brewing over the favoring of Hugh, Edward didn't want to leave the country. Rather than paying homage himself, he had his 12-year-old son, Edward, made Duke of Aquitaine and go in his place. Prince Edward went to France with his mother Isabella of France, and this was meant to make a peace treaty with France. But while they were there, Isabella met up with Roger Mortimer, who had been exiled in France after being found guilty of a rebellion against Edward II in opposition to Hugh. Isabella and Roger conspired together to depose Edward. To support this, Isabella had Prince Edward betrothed to Philippa of Hainault. An invasion on Edward II was launched, and he was deserted by his men. Isabella and Roger, who had become lovers at this point, summoned Parliament, and Edward II was forced to give up the throne to his son Edward. So Prince Edward was made king at 14 on January 25th of 1327 in London. His coronation took place 6 days later on February 1st at Westminster Abbey. One of Edward's first acts as king was to lead another campaign. I gotta find my number. Into Scotland in July of 1327. It wasn't long into his reign that there were problems caused by the central position of Roger at court. Roger had become de facto ruler. I was picking up my face prior to this, and now I'm all red, so we're gonna do this, and then so people were not happy. His unpopularity grew even more when the English were defeated by Scotland at the Battle of Stanhope Park in Durham. Out of this came the Treaty of Edinburgh and Northampton in 1328. Edward III was starting to have issues with Roger as well, and Roger knew he was on thin ice. Edward married Philippa, first by proxy through the Bishop of Coventry in Valenciennes in October of 1327. They were married in person on January 24th of 1328 at York Minster. Edward was 15. That is not the palette I was using. Edward was 15 and Philippa was not quite 14. After their wedding, they went to live at Woodstock Palace in Oxfordshire. Philippa's coronation was held on February 30th. No, it doesn't even exist. On February 18th of 1330 at Westminster Abbey, and she was 5 months pregnant at the time. She gave birth to their first child, a son named Edward, at Woodstock Palace. It was after this that Edward took action against Roger. I'm left wondering if Edward, knowing he had an heir, gave him more power and a better leg to stand on against Roger. So Edward captured Roger at Nottingham Castle, and he was subsequently executed. Isabella was placed under house arrest at Windsor for the next 2 years, and then was moved back to her own residence, Castle Rising in Norfolk. Following in his grandfather's footsteps, Edward went to war with Scotland. We can't just leave well enough alone, can we, people? Jesus Christ. The English defeated Scotland at the Battle of Duplin Moor in 32, and then Edward attempted to make Balliol as King of Scotland in place of David II, who was an infant at the time. Balliol was expelled and went to Edward for help, and so Edward laid siege to Berwick and won the Battle of Halidon Hill. But Berwick was taken after the Scottish set fire to the town, and the English were forced to surrender. Philippa was under siege at Bamburgh Castle, and it was too late to save the Scottish campaign. Edward reinstated Balliol on the throne and received a good amount of land in southern Scotland. This didn't last long though, because David's supporters gained control of the country. Edward agreed to a truce with Scotland in 38. It was also in the late 30s that Edward started rebuilding the nobility. He had previously been pacifying two noble parties, one that was against his father father, and the other that had been opposed to Isabella and Roger's regime. The only loyalists he had was the Earls of Arundel, Oxford, and Warwick. So Edward created a duke and 8 new earls, some of which were Gloucester, Northampton, Huntingdon, Lancaster, Salisbury, and Suffolk. In 1337, Philip VI of France took England's Duchy of Aquitaine and the country of Ponthieu. So instead of trying for a peaceful resolution like his dad, Edward came back at him and laid claim to the French crown as the grandson of Philip IV, his mother's father. The French rejected this and upheld the rights of Philip IV's nephew, Philip VI. The tensions that came from this led to the 100 Years' War. It was because of this that the first stage of the war is named the Edwardian era, or referred to as the Edwardian era. So it was by this time that Edward and Philippa had 5 children, but only 8 had survived infancy. They were Edward the Black Prince, Isabella, Joan, and Lionel. Edward and his family were living in the Low Countries, what is now Belgium and Netherlands in that area, to form a coalition of allies against France. Lionel was born in Antwerp, and a few years later we have John of Gaunt, or John was born in Ghent, hence why they're called Lionel of Antwerp and John of Gaunt, because Gaunt is Ghent in English. On June 24th of 1340, the English were victorious at Sluys and secured control of the English Channel. In this event, part of the French fleet were destroyed. I'm just winging this out a little bit. Then I'm gonna go back in and blend that. This fucking spot, man. There we go. So this lessened the likelihood of a French invasion in England. This lasted less than a year. I'm going to pull that in a little bit. That's going to bug me. Because of the high cost of war, or because of this invasion, people back home were very unhappy, were not happy at all with the increasing national debt. At the same time, Edward and his commanders were angry by the failure of the government in England to provide them with the needed funds for this. So Edward went back to England and got into London on November 30th of 1340. There he found the affairs of the country in disorder, and so he got rid of the royal admin of ministers and judges. This didn't give domestic stability. Instead, it brought on a standoff between Edward and John de Stratford, Archbishop of Canterbury. During this, Stratford's relatives, Robert Stratford, Bishop of Chichester, was stripped of his title, and Henry de Stratford was imprisoned. In January of 44, Edward created a sense of community with the creation of a new order of chivalry and held a great feast at Windsor Castle. Now I'm going to go back in and just blend that in. A ton of people were invited, and there was a feast on the first night with all the ladies in just 2 nights. It was followed by jousting for the next 3 days, and Edward was made champion. Shocker. Edward announced that he was founding a round table of King Arthur, and certain lords would take an oath. By the early 40s, Edward's alliances were too expensive and came with little results. I'm going to jump off and do my liner. I'll be right back. So in 46, he staged an invasion and sailed for Normandy with 15,000 men. They sacked Caen and met up with the Flemish force in Flanders. On August 26, he and his army defeated the French army in the Battle of Crécy. Not long after this, the English army returned to England and defeated Scotland and captured David II after the Battle of Mortimer's Cross in Durham, England. So with the northern border secure, he went back to France and laid siege to Calais. This was the greatest English venture of the 100 Years' War. This siege lasted almost a year, and eventually the city fell to England. England held Calais for almost 200 years. Come 48, Edward and Philippa had 10 children. We're up to 10 at this point. So now we're at the following: Edward, Isabella, Joan, Lionel, John, Edmund, Mary, Margaret, Thomas, and William. The last child was born in June of 48. So the Black Death hit England this year. The royal couple lost 3 of their children to the Black Death in September of 48. Joan was roughly 15 years old. Thomas was about a year, and William only about 2.5, 3 months old. This plague saw the loss of a third or more of the country's population. As we know from going through COVID, this was a huge hit to the country. Shortage of manpower and inflation and labor costs. In 49, Edward in Parliament passed the Ordinance of Laborers, and it was followed by the Statute of Laborers in 51. It was an attempt to regulate wage and wasn't successful in the long run, but for the time being, it was heavily enforced. Backing up to right before the plague for a second, Edward founded the Order of the Garter. This new order had a hidden meaning from the legend by the circular shape of the garter. There's no formal references to King Arthur and the Round Table, but the Garter Feast of 58 did involve a round table game. Because of this, there is some overlap between the Round Table Fellowship and the actual Order of the Garter. 1356 brought an important victory in the Battle of Poitiers. This was led by Edward, the Black Prince. This nickname came for Edward later on. He was not referred to that way when he was alive. It's supposedly from his black armor or jousting shield, but there's no evidence that he actually wore black armor. The English force was outnumbered, but they still managed to win and capture the now King John II of France and his young son Philip. Edward now had possessions in France, and its central government completely collapsed. It was questioned if Edward's claim to the French throne was genuine or if it was a political ploy. But in 1360, Edward accepted the Treaty of Bretagne and renounced his claim to the English throne, but he kept his French possessions. Now, prior to Edward III's reign, his father and grandfather were stingy when it came to creating earls and dukedoms. Edward did not follow in this pattern. As I said before, he created quite a few in the beginning, but as time went on, he created more. He introduced new titles of duke to close relatives to the monarch. He created the first dukedoms in England. They were Cornwall, Lancaster, and Clarence. These were given to his 2 eldest boys, Edward and Lionel, Cornwall and Clarence respectively. The Lancaster title was elevated from Earl to Duke. This one goes to one of his boys, but only through the son's marriage. We'll get there. Story for another day. The fear of French invasion strengthened the nation's unity. There was a rumor that had started during Edward I's reign that the French were going to get rid of the English language. Edward III made the most of this. In 62, a statute of pleading was passed, and this ordered English to be used in the law courts. However, the statute was written in French and had a tiny immediate effect. Edward's later reign wasn't as successful as his early reign. He started relying on those around him, in particular William Wykeham, or Wickham, is the spelling. He made William Keeper of the Privy Seal and Chancellor, but Parliament made him resign the latter title. Edward was struggling with his trusted men around him dying, some in war, others from the second wave of the plague. This included one of the greatest captains, Henry of Grosmont, Duke of Lancaster. Edward started relying on his sons for leadership of military operations operations. Lionel attempted to subdue Anglo-Irish lords in Ireland. This failed. In 69, John of Gaunt led a military campaign in France with the uptick of pending problems coming from them. This also failed. England lost most of its possessions except for the coastal towns of Calais, Bordeaux, and Bayonne. While at Windsor Castle, Queen Philippa was sick with edema, which is swelling, like water retention. Philippa died on August 15th of 1369 at the age of roughly 56. She was given a full state funeral on January 9th of 1370 and was interred into Westminster Abbey. Her tomb was on the north side of the chapel of Edward the Confessor, and she is opposite or on the opposite side of Edward's grandparents, Edward I and Eleanor of Castile. So many monarchs of the time had mistresses, and Edward was no different. Alice Perrers was originally one of Philippa's household ladies. When Alice turned 18, her husband had died, and it looks like she landed in the arms of the king. Edward gave her land, manors, and jewels, even the jewels that had belonged to Philippa. Things didn't go really well for Alice in the end, and she is on my radar for something down the line. I'm gonna jump off and do what is this? Mascara. I'll be right back. So I used the Definicils by Lancome mascara, and I've been doing the Grande Lash morning and night, and I'm noticing a huge difference in my lashes, which is phenomenal. I did try this, and it's great. It doesn't fucking come off at all. So I will give it I've only used it once. I'll give it another shot, but I really struggled with this coming off, and I'm not a fan of that because I'm not breaking my lashes off for a mascara. Sorry, not happening. Anyways, because of the military failures in France and the financial pressure of the constant campaign. Oh my God. That was a lot. The constant campaigning. There was political unhappiness again in England. Don't we fucking know it? In 1371, complaining about the royal spending became more of an issue. And this all came to a head. I'm going to put stuff in my hair, so I'm just grabbing that. This all came to a head in 76. Parliament was called to grant taxation, but the House of Commons took the opportunity to address specific grievances. If you want to know what I'm using, it is the Color Wow Extra Large Bombshell Volumizer. And I can't use a lot of it because I think it weighs my hair down, but it does work really well. Specifically, disapproval was directed at some of Edward's, oh my God, closest advisors. Next, I'm going to use the Goldwell Just Smooth 6 Effects Serum. So I literally am going to take like half a pump. That's it. Lord Chamberlain William Latimer and John Neville were dismissed from their positions. Alice Perrers was the mistress, was banished from court, but she came back around later that year and was back in Edward's inner circle. I'm just going to take extra of that Goldwell, and I'm just going to smooth my ends with that because I'm going to blow dry in a second. The main adversary of the Commons, with the support of William Wykeham and Edmund Mortimer, was John of Gaunt, Edward's third son. The king and his oldest son, Edward, were both very ill at the time. So John was the next in line, but not for the throne. John was forced to give in to the demands of Parliament, and when they met again in 77, most of Parliament's achievements were reversed. I am going to blow dry my hair. I'm going to be right back. I'm back. So Edward had become increasingly ill with an abscess that started in the end of September of 76. He got a little bit better in February of 77, but it took a turn for the worse and died on June 21st of 77 of a stroke at Sheehan at the age of 64. His funeral was held on July 5th at Westminster Abbey, and he was buried next to his wife, Philippa, in the Abbey. So Edward was succeeded by his grandson, Richard, son of Edward the Black Prince. I'm going to try and do this top bit as I talk. Edward the Black Prince, had passed away on June 8th of 1376. Following the death of the Black Prince, Edward signed letters on the order of succession. The second position was given to his third son, John of Gaunt. This completely jumped over Edward's granddaughter, Philippa, who was daughter of Lionel. Lionel had already passed away at this time, and this decision contrasted with the decision of Edward I that recognized the right of a woman to inherit the crown and pass it to her descendants. But the order passed in 76 led the House of Lancaster to the throne in 99. It was this situation that led to the War of the Roses about 75 years later. I'm going to put my lipstick on and then we're going to come back for fun fact. So I'm using, got this from Vive. It's the Brat combo. So it's like a small lip liner and then a full size lipstick. I really love this color, especially for my skin tone. This is a really nice autumnal color for me. Anyways, so fun facts. We haven't done this in a while. I'm excited. I love fun facts. So his father was probably murdered. Edward III's father, Edward II, was probably murdered. Could have been by a spear up the ass. Could have been something else. Edward, is known for restoring royal authority after the disastrous reign of his father. He was married to Philippa for 40 years and both were happy in the marriage. The couple had 13 children total. Edward III is literally the daddy of the English throne. Every monarch after him is a descendant of him. And lastly, we are all, in the whole of the world, literally related to him in one way or another. So everybody on this planet at this point in time is literally related to him, which I think is crazy. But that's all I have for fun facts, and that's all I have for this episode. I hope that you enjoyed it. I am going to go into, I think I'm going to do Philippa next, or I might do the Black Prince next. We'll see. Also, this Friday will be a year for me on YouTube. My first video came out on November 7th. No, Thursday, not 2 days from now. Thursday will be my 1 year here. I love doing this. I love doing this so much. It's my two loves, and it's so fun to do the research and to go through all this. And I've learned so much, even though I knew some of it, but doing this constantly, I have learned so much. If you have not yet subscribed to my channel, my hair is a mess today. This is what we're doing. Please subscribe. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you learned something or you have a question or I pronounced something wrong, which I do all the time, please leave a comment down below and school me on the pronunciation or whatever. If you are on Instagram and TikTok, if you want to head over there and give me a follow on both of those things, you can find me at Makeup and Monarchies. If you enjoy this content and would like to help with my support me in doing this, you can go on over to buymeacoffee.com/Makeup and Monarchies and donate to my coffee fund so that I can continue to go to Starbucks while I do all this research. That's all I have for today. I hope that you enjoyed it. I will see you in the next one. I know this comes out on election day. I'm not getting political. I'm just saying it comes out on election day. So we'll see what happens. I hope you enjoyed this. Thanks for watching, guys. See you in the next one. Bye.